In the aftermath of the Great War, it's difficult to separate fact from fiction, history from myth, truth from legend. What is never in doubt is that in the autumn of 2281, a courier accepted a parcel that would change the course of their lives and the entire Mojave forever. This account is just one of the many that follow the courier through their journey. This is Legends of the Mojave. It seemed like he had no sooner closed his eyes than he felt a sharp pain in the backside. His eyes snapped open and were instantly assaulted by the bright morning sun. Apparently, he had slept through her more gentle attempts to rouse him from his slumber, and Veronica was ready for her watch to be up so they could finally hit the road. A swift kick to get the ball rolling was apparently the next logical choice. The courier rose to a crouched position. He was thankful to have someone to trade sleep shifts with for safety's sake, but he wasn't sure he appreciated the sly grin she gave as he rubbed his sore hind end. He glanced off to the north. The ruins of Vegas now stretched before them. He smelled the food cooking over at Sam and Michelle's temporary food court here at the 188 trade post, but decided he'd rather just gnaw on something that he had in his pack while en route to Vegas. As he turned toward the on-ramp, his heart about leapt from his throat as he was suddenly staring face to face with a Robco Security Model 2060B. Victor. Not again. Not today. It seemed that no matter where he went, Victor followed. In the desert just outside Goodsprings, Victor tracked him down and told him to stick to the safer route through Nipton. He had somehow beat the courier to Novak and was by all appearances waiting for him when he arrived. Now here he was, apparently following the courier from Boulder City. As usual, any attempt to garner any useful information from Victor proved doomed to disappointment, and as he bid farewell, the courier was dismayed to see him heading off toward New Vegas in the exact direction he had planned to travel. He had had enough. It felt like he was just a mole rat running a maze. Someone clearly wanted him to follow this path to New Vegas, this exact trail, and was sending Victor to ensure he was doing as expected. That was assuming Victor himself wasn't the one pulling the strings. He didn't know who or what was controlling Victor, but the courier didn't like the idea of being leashed. He didn't know what laid between him and Vegas, but one thing that he did know was that Highway 95 wasn't the only road to Vegas. He looked down the pavement of the 188 trade post, the confluence between Highway 95 and 93. If he was reading the map on his Pip-Boy correctly, this place marked the start of a roadway that linked up with the Long 15 north of the dangers at Quarry Junction. It was settled. He and his new traveling companion would cut westward to the Long 15 and follow it up to Vegas. Maybe that would be enough to allow them to finally give Victor the slip. So they set off, the towers of New Vegas to their right, the rolling McCullough Hills to their left. The pair traveled in virtual silence. The courier could feel it, that raw survival instinct telling him that they weren't alone out here. They were being watched. He kept constant watch on the hills for shadows, signs of movement, his mind ever so often returning to the warning signs littering Sloan. But thankfully, the most dangerous thing they had seen that morning were some Mr. Handys busying themselves about the maintenance at the RepCon headquarters. The courier had to chuckle at that. General Atomics robots maintaining a facility that was effectively owned by Robco. If he hadn't been so tantalizingly close to his target and so uneasy about their current position, the courier might have surrendered to his curiosity and gone inside to investigate. But today, at least, he had bigger lizards to fry. As soon as his heel hit the crossroads, he felt a wave of pride, of accomplishment, even if it was a day late and a bottle cap short. He was standing once again on the Long 15, where he had hoped to be standing by the end of his first day outside Goodsprings. He would have basked in this achievement a while longer, were it not for the hairs standing up on the back of his neck. He and Veronica crouched down almost in perfect sync. The courier looked south in utter horror. The hills were crawling with death claws, not one or two, but what seemed like dozens. They filled his field of view, stretching as far as the eye could see. Luckily, they didn't seem to have noticed the duo just yet, probably the only reason they were still alive. This, he thought to himself, was a stupid idea. He and Veronica crept their way up the Long 15 as quickly but as silently and nonchalantly as they could. Is it even possible to act casual in the presence of Deathclaws? After what seemed like an eternity, the duo was able to put some distance between them and the Deathclaws, and finally started to relax. But the Courier soon discovered that may have been a bit premature. They were approaching a residence along the side of the road, and it wasn't abandoned. It was being patrolled by armed men. Once they were close enough to make out the blue denim jackets, there was no doubt who these men were. Powder gangers. Taking a look around, it wasn't immediately apparent whether this house was abandoned when the gangers found it, or whether they evicted the original tenants, but he didn't feel like sticking around to find out which. Not far away, he spotted another house. About the same time, he spotted energy weapons fire coming from that direction. Without thinking, he ran straight towards the action, as he could make out a group of geckos attacking whoever was there. The fight had already been decided by the time he arrived. The geckos had been dealt with, and the group packing energy weapons and automatics were already settling back into their routine. More powder gangers. This was surprising to the Courier, who had dealt with the powder gangers pretty extensively by now. They were usually armed with either improvised weapons or basic small arms that were barely suited for riot control taken during their uprising in the NCRCF. The fact that this group was wielding weaponry fit for wiping out Legion or NCR patrols was unsettling, especially when he remembered that the man who had masterminded the powder ganger revolt had headed north with his followers to start a guerrilla war against the NCR. This group was probably the very same that had confiscated Sloan's explosives cache, and by the looks of things was now beginning to hit other well-armed groups in order to take their weapons for themselves. The whole Brahmin roasting on a spit paired with their impressive arsenal of energy weapons seemed to suggest that this group had most likely just hit a Van Graff's weapon shipment recently, and the Courier wasn't about to stick around to figure out how desirable his and Veronica's gear was to them. It was decision time. The Courier had no love of the NCR, but at the moment they were a far better alternative to Caesar's Legion, and the last thing the Mojave needed was a band of energy weapon-toting, explosive-hurling freedom fighters causing havoc on the home front, and directing NCR resources away from the front so that the Legion could swarm across the Colorado River. He wasn't sure what his aims were. He had withheld judgment against the powder gangers in the past, and however unsavory most of them were, he didn't get the impression that the majority were necessarily evil, just a bit short-sighted and prone to making poor decisions. He wasn't sure how the situation would play out, but he was going to confront the powder ganger leader, hear him out, and if possible see if there was any way to at least guarantee the safety of civilians. Better still if he could get them to start hitting Legion raiding parties as well. Then at least both major players in the Mojave could be disrupted equally. He wasn't quite sure where he had heard it. Maybe it was knowledge that was still rattling around in his head since before a bullet kept it company, but he seemed to think there was some sort of fortress in a rocky pass nearby. If he was leading a group of freedom fighters, he would want a good place to hide in the hills, and these farmhouses he had been encountering were obviously nothing more than outposts, meant to hit easy targets that wandered by and provide warning of a not-so-easy one approaching. Their headquarters had to be somewhere close. So he and Veronica kept heading west. Every once in a while, they would spot the hulking outline of Deathclaws to the south, and these canyons were perfect nesting grounds for cazadors, but thankfully, they were left alone long enough to reach a fenced-in parking lot surrounded by cliffs. This place seemed odd. Why would there be a secured parking lot here of all places? The only structure was a security booth in the middle of the parking lot. Closer inspection showed it contained a manhole cover, and when they descended the depths to check it out, they discovered it, the unmistakable outline of a Vault-Tec cog door, Vault 19. The Courier didn't know much about the vaults, only that they usually weren't the safe havens they were marketed as on the billboards that littered the wasteland. Still, people like Doc Mitchell couldn't have survived as vault dwellers if they weren't defensible, and this door was obviously sturdy, so this seemed like as good a place as any to look for a band of guerrilla fighters. The dingy, long-abandoned vault interior exuded such an air of foreboding that it nearly caused the pair to turn back. But thankfully, the first room that they explored contained a human occupant who wasn't immediately hostile, at least not physically. Samuel Cook, the powder ganger ringleader and anti-NCR extremist in the flesh. Cook was livid, pacing around what looked like an overseer's office and paranoid as can be. Apparently, one of his followers wasn't so keen on his plan to destroy the NCR and was starting to form a splinter group among this band of powder gangers who wished to negotiate and turn themselves into the NCR, a plan which Cook was adamantly opposed to. He needed to regain his men's confidence, and in his mind, more explosives was the way to accomplish that. Apparently, what they had on hand was running low, and he would need a lot more if he was going to orchestrate his little rebellion. Apparently, in the depths of the vault were some underground tunnels that were supposedly rich in sulfur deposits, a vital ingredient in homegrown explosives, and Cook needed a trail cleared to them. The courier told him that he would look into clearing the way to the sulfur supply and bade his farewell. He wasn't so sure he intended to actually follow through with that promise, but he knew better than to give Cook a reason to distrust him further. Before he made his way for the tunnels, he was going to take a look around. He wanted to talk to this guy Lem, the so-called coward who wanted to bow down to the NCR. After looking around this section of the vault, he found what looked like a completely different overseer's office. This vault had 2 overseers? Just what was going on in this place? This office was occupied by Philip Lem, who wasn't exactly what Cook made him out to be. He was apparently the main organizer of the NCRCF prison break. Cook made the plans, stashed the weapons, and assumed command, but it was Lem that organized the prisoners, shared plans and information, and gathered allies. Lem asked him to cut off access to the sulfur in the caves. Without access to more explosives, the Powderganger rebellion would be dead before it even got its feet under it, and the convicts would have no choice but to approach the NCR to negotiate terms for surrender. Neither of these men, Lem or Cook, were very likable, but this wasn't even a choice that warranted any serious consideration. These men were dangerous for all the wrong reasons, and Lem, well, he wasn't doing it for the right reasons, but his actions would allow the greatest chance to allow the NCR to push more troops to the banks of the Colorado where they were desperately needed. As he poked around the vault, he discovered some explosive charges stashed around that the courier helped himself to. These would probably come in handy, as long as he didn't blow himself sky high in the process. As he explored the vault on his way to the caves, he discovered that this vault had 2 separate populations, red and blue. Each population lived in different spaces and even answered to separate overseers. I guess that's why the 2 offices. Both populations were highly discouraged from interacting with each other or visiting the other side of the vault, and apparently the vault was home to a number of disturbed individuals. Both sides relied on the lone psychiatrist in the vault for therapy, and, well, let's just say this place was a powder keg long before anyone tried to get to the sulfur down below. When he reached the caves, he discovered they were infested with fire geckos, so no question as to why the Powdergangers weren't going to risk this assignment themselves. He rigged the explosive charges to the largest concentration of sulfur he could find in the caves and ran like hell. He and Veronica had just made it back to the vault when the explosion shook the entire complex. That must have been one hell of an explosion when even a vault shuddered under the stress. He reported his actions to Lem, who actually appeared quite relieved, and in an act that surprised the courier, he stated that surrendering was the right thing to do, that perhaps rule of law is the only thing that separated wastelanders from raiders. An interesting sentiment for an escaped convict, but still something felt poignant about the delivery. Like a spoiled child, Cook locked himself in his overseer's office and refused to come out. The courier didn't pay him much mind. He wasn't much of a threat to anyone in his current state, and if he ever did sack up and try and leave the vault, he was now just as likely to be killed by a deathclaw or by fiends as he was to actually hurt anyone. So by all appearances, the courier's work here was done. As he returned to the surface and breathed in that crisp night air, the courier couldn't help but sympathize with these men. These Powdergangers, at the end of the day, other than one bad apple, were really just desperate to change their circumstances. Many of them didn't deserve death, at least not nearly as much as some other people in this wasteland. Many had realized the error of their ways and were just looking for an opportunity to turn their lives around. He couldn't believe he was doing this. He looked off to the north at the strip, its lights beckoning him from the distance. And instead, he turned back eastward, back toward Highway 95. Throughout his travels, he had turned a blind eye to the suffering of these men as convicts, men who were reaping the seeds they had sown in this bitter, desolate land. After all, it wasn't his place to judge. Who was he to decide their fates? But he had been judging, at every turn. He had wiped out the Powdergangers who had taken over Prim. He had gunned down several individuals, mostly in self-defense, some even in an act of mercy, but all were dead at his hands, and he had already been playing judge, jury, and executioner whether he wanted to believe it or not. So it was time to stop hiding behind excuses, behind cowardice. It was time to close the book on the powder gangers for good this time. It made no logical sense to anyone but the Courier, but over the next several days he completely retraced his steps from the moment he was pulled out of the ground. On Highway 95 overlooking Searchlight was the Legion slaver camp where the powder gangers who were lucky enough to receive third place in the Nipton lottery were being held. The Courier dressed himself in a Legion uniform he had pulled off a corpse on the side of the road, and when the guards' attention was diverted, he released the prisoners, then kicked sand as quickly as he could without raising suspicion. 2 lives spared the horror of Legion servitude, and his relationship with the Legion, at least if he had one, remained intact. He returned to Nipton, where Boxcars was still sitting and waiting for the inevitable with his crippled legs, the lucky second-place winner. The Courier hurled a fistful of Med-X at the ungrateful little bastard and continued west. Maybe as his legs slowly healed, he might finally learn some manners. Nobody deserved to die in that place, and it was obvious nobody else was going to be stopping off in Nipton to lend a helping hand anytime soon. The Courier continued onward past Nipton and headed up the Long 15, past Prim, past the NCRCF, and turned left. It wasn't long before, for the first time since this quest began, he felt like he was home. He and Veronica were standing at the steps of the Prospector Saloon in Goodsprings. He headed inside and was greeted like he had never even left town. It felt strange. He could scarcely remember the warm feelings he had felt about this place as these people nursed him back to health and set him on his path. It felt like a dream, like a different lifetime altogether. But he had one purpose in returning to this place. He approached Trudy and asked her the question he had avoided when they last met, about the man that had threatened her, the man in an NCRCF uniform, Joe Cobb. Turns out, the town had been harboring a caravaner who had escaped a powder ganger attack, and for some reason, the powder gangers were dead set on finishing the job. The Courier went to go see the man, named Ringo, holed up in the empty Poseidon station on the western end of town, and sure enough, the guy seemed harmless, even though he talked a good talk there for a minute. Problem was, Cobb had himself a posse, sort of an oxymoron for a group of convicts, but the term fit, and it was only a matter of time before they rolled into town pistols drawn and dynamite at the ready to deal with Ringo, and send a bloody message the town of Goodsprings couldn't possibly ignore. So it was time for the Courier to rally some allies of his own. Sunny Smiles didn't take any convincing at all. In an act all too natural to her character, Sunny swore to lend her services whatever may happen, and to see if she could convince anyone around town to help out. The Courier then set to convincing Easy Pete to part with his old stash of dynamite, though Pete made sure he wasn't giving it up to just any fool who didn't know a blasting cap from a bottle cap. As the unofficial town mayor, Trudy's word carried a lot of weight, and she eventually was convinced to throw in with the Courier's army of Goodsprings, which brought other settlers to their cause. He even convinced that cheapskate Chet at the general store to hand over a few suits of leather armor for anyone willing to fight, though Chet, true to his character, chose to stay behind and cower in his store. Doc Mitchell even threw in a few stim packs and doctor's bags just in case things turned bloody. Just as Cobb and his men were spotted marching toward town, the Courier thought to himself it sure would be nice to have a Securitron on their side about now. But Victor was probably hiding behind a pile of rubble somewhere outside Vegas, just waiting to jump out and scare the crap out of him, and probably would have found an excuse not to fight anyway. The Courier hoped this show of force would be enough to convince Cobb to settle down and keep out of town, but it seems Cobb didn't have the sense of a jet-addled Brahmin. The ensuing shootout was child's play. The Courier had been alone on the road for so long, isolated, outnumbered, and surrounded by danger that having the entire town of Goodsprings, not to mention Veronica, backing him up, well, the situation felt surreal. He felt almost invincible. After the last gunshot had faded into the echoing distance, as folks went back about their lives like nothing had happened, he realized once again that he couldn't stay here. He had done what he came to do. The battered bodies of the powder gangers stood as stark warnings to any left who thought they could prey on the good people of the Mojave. This was it. The powder gangers had its leadership wiped out by the NCR counterassault. The Prim convicts had fought to the last man. Cook's rebellion had failed and his followers were surrendering in droves. Most of the powder gangers that had thought to attack the NCR in Nipton were now dead, and the few survivors had some harrowing tales to tell of what lies outside the now penetrated fences and watchtowers of the NCRCF. And now with the death of Cobb's cronies, not to mention the unknown but assumed death of Chavez, who wandered into the desert after he was ordered to to stop hitting caravans now meant that the roads and surrounding townships were relatively safe. The powder gangers from this day forward would cease to be a force to be reckoned with, a boogeyman haunting the Long 15, a distraction for the NCR army, or an unwitting tool for the Legion. And the people of Goodsprings now had a fearsome reputation. Everyone in town now had their own supply of first aid supplies, suits of leather armor, and they had proven that by standing together they were more than a mere village scraping by. They were a bastion against the dangers of the wastes, a sanctuary. Finally, it felt like the Courier had found a way to repay them for everything they had done for him after that fateful night with Benny and the Cons. As he and Veronica strode out of town and returned to the Long 15, he decided to do the unthinkable. The thought of turning south to make the Nipton loop up the 95 yet again wearied him something fierce. So he instead turned north towards Sloan. The first time he approached Quarry Junction, he had a measly arsenal barely suited to fending off geckos and bandits in his possession, and precious little ammunition to feed it. The closest thing to armor he was wearing was Doc Mitchell's old vault suit, and he was alone. This time around, he strolled into Sloan with powerful weapons and plenty of bullets. He was wearing advanced and expensive combat armor he had picked up from the gunrunners and had even given Veronica a fine set of armor for herself. A far sight better than those rags she had been wearing when they met, anyway. It was time to stop running. It was time to stop glancing over his shoulder in fear. It was time to open the Long 15 for business. The two went into the quarry. One by one, they picked off the death claws. One would come out to investigate the gunshots, and they too were taken down in a hail of lead and sometimes a power fist to the spinal column. The two of them systematically worked into the night. With nerves of steel and probably filled breeches, they worked tirelessly to lure the Deathclaws into killing fields. The morning sun had already risen high above the clouds by the time the Pack Alpha and Mother Deathclaws had fallen. The quarry once again fell silent. The people of Sloan could once again begin their work, and the noise would hopefully keep any new packs of Deathclaws from moving in. By the time the Courier reached the base of the Sloan Pass, he was completely out of ammo. That had never happened to him before. But as he stood in the same place that he and Veronica had so recently glanced up to witness the hills alive with claws and fangs and sinew, he now looked back to see only stillness and hearing only silence, knowing that once again the Long 15 was open for travelers working their way through the Mojave. After savoring the moment for a bit, he finally turned toward the lights of the strip in the distance. It was finally time to end this wandering. No more procrastinating, no more righting wrongs, no more settling up accounts with the Mojave. There was only one more score left to settle. Nothing was standing in his way now. After fighting literal armies of men and abominations alike, soon he would be entering Vegas. By invitation or by siege, it was time to end this.